Good morning, everyone. My name is Meg, and I'm pleased to be introducing Bonnie Docherty, who is a lecturer on law and a senior clinical instructor at the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. Bonnie received her AB from Harvard University. She then worked as a journalist for 3 years before receiving her JD from Harvard Law School. She worked full-time at Human Rights Watch before joining the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard in 2005. As a field researcher and lawyer, Bonnie has played an active role in the campaign against cluster munitions and participated in negotiations for the Convention on Cluster Munitions prior to it being adopted in 2008. More recently, she has taken a lead in the emerging campaign against fully autonomous weapons. She has also conducted research on climate change refugees, the effects of armed conflict on civilians, and the effects of mining on indigenous communities. So please join me in welcoming Bonnie Docherty to the Albright Institute.
Great, thanks, Meg. And I appreciate both the invitation to be here, and it's a real honor to talk to this crowd. I was very impressed with the lively discussion this morning, so look forward to continuing that, hopefully, before lunch. So I've been working in disarmament for about 12 years. I was interested in armed conflict issues in law school, but hadn't really focused on disarmament. And I got a fellowship at Human Rights Watch right after law school, and I was supposed to start September 12th, 2001. Needless to say, the start date didn't actually happen. It got pushed off a week. But whatever the project they had planned for me went out the window, and 6 months later, I was in Afghanistan researching cluster munitions. It was my first exposure to these weapons, and I guess it was fortuitous because 12 years later, I'm still working on them, as well as on other disarmament issues. So my goal today is to introduce you to disarmament law and its recent evolution, and also to leave you with some questions about current cutting-edge issues in the field. I'm going to focus on what's called humanitarian disarmament, which is the most recent form to take hold, and examine that through two case studies, the Convention on Cluster Munitions and fully autonomous weapons, also known as killer robots. So just to get us started, because I would like this to be somewhat interactive, I wanted to throw out a question to you, which is, what kind of suffering can weapons cause? It seems like a very simple question, but I think it's useful to think about all the ranges of types of suffering that weapons can cause. So I gather you have a mic system, which I'll leave you guys in charge of. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for being here today. Psychological, because just the knowledge that weapons are present also means that there's knowledge that no one is safe. Mm-hmm. So just that basic threat of knowing that your life in some respect is not secure.
Great. So psychological, and that's even before they've been used. That's a really good point. Great. Other thoughts right behind you.
They can cause suffering on an individual scale, so you could get some kind of injury or you could die as the result of a weapon, but also if you think about Hiroshima, they can cause suffering on not only a small scale but on a large scale that leaves an imprint not only on that region but also on that country and then affects the rest of the world in turn.
Great, great. So looking at both, I like the individual versus community and even global scale, and you raised the physical injuries as in addition to the psychological, so go ahead.
So they can also cause economic suffering because if you're destroying a lot of infrastructure, that takes a long time to build up. Right. So you lose a lot of damage in that. And there are also different time frames in suffering because you can have an incident where it's like, boom, a lot of people die, or you can have something where you use chemical weapons and it goes by like generations and generations where women have mutilated children.
Great, yeah. We'll work our way down the line, I guess.
I was thinking, on going off of psychological, I was thinking about the psychological effects on an individual. So even if somebody doesn't die, or they could still have psychological effects from that one moment in time. And also I was thinking about in war, we have snipers, and a lot of these snipers tend to have post-traumatic stress disorder because they have to live with the knowledge that they have killed so many people.
Great. So that brings up both the psychological after an attack, but also the soldier harm that is caused, the military harm is caused, as well as the civilian harm. That's a really important point. How about right back there?
So I'm not sure how to phrase this, but I would say the long-term welfare of a country, because as we've seen with the proxy wars from the Cold War, afterwards weapons are left among different groups and they might use it for their own benefit in the future. And also the reading you assigned, your article mentioned that there may be leftover landmines or things that an innocent child or person might step on and injure themselves. So.
Right. And so that's a long-term effect, not just in terms of an individual who continues to suffer from an injury, but the fact that injuries can occur from like a mine, for example, many years later. So I have one more in the back row there, and we'll have other times to ask questions too. So.
I was thinking in terms of global affairs and so that weapons and the use of weapons can severely affect nations' relations with one another, and that can cause suffering on a huge global scale. Right, good. So it's one thing about weapons is, as you said, it's very local in some ways, but also very global, and I think that fits with the theme of this institute, from what I understand. The one other one that I had thought of that didn't come up was also dislocation, that weapons can cause refugees, particularly those, for example, someone mentioned mines. People can no longer live in certain areas because of the presence of weapons that are lingering after a conflict. So that's another injury or type of harm to keep in mind. So these various sorts of suffering doesn't mean that all weapons have been banned, as you know, or even maybe that they should be banned. That's open for discussion. But it shows, as a result of this, many weapons have been either banned or regulated, restricted in their use. So I just want to say a few words briefly about the history of disarmament law. It can be traced back 150 years to what's called the St. Petersburg Declaration, which prohibited these small explosive projectiles that cause unnecessary suffering to victims. So issues of, they might be accurate, but they cause excessive suffering, either to soldiers or civilians. This declaration was followed at the turn of the century by treaties on balloon-launched explosives. Way before air war, balloon-launched explosives were considered highly dangerous. Sea mines and dum-dum bullets. World War II saw the extensive use of poison gas, which caused horrific suffering for the people who experienced it. And that led to the 1925 Geneva Protocol banning the use of that weapon, which in turn would lead to the Chemical Weapons Convention many years later. Then there was a decades-long hiatus for disarmament law. There were what they call quantitative arms control measures, which are efforts to control how many weapons a country has. So that would be most seen in the nuclear weapons context. But there was no qualitative instruments to regulate or ban the use of weapons. Disarmament law got a new birth about 40 years ago with the adoption of the Biological Weapons Convention, which led to the string of treaties that you read about in the handout that I gave before the class. So as you gathered from that reading, I divide disarmament law into three different types: security, hybrid, and humanitarian. So the security treaties, which are exemplified by the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention, which has obviously been in the news a lot over the past 6 months because of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And these treaties are adopted primarily for national security reasons. And that relates to the part of Professor Goddard's talk I heard, which was mostly about global security, national security issues, sovereignty issues. And these treaties focus on preventive measures. They're absolute prohibitions, absolute bans on weapons, the production, transfer, stockpiling, and in some cases use of weapons. They also require destruction of stockpiles and production facilities. And they usually have rigorous, what they call verification measures, which are efforts where you can check to see if, like Syria, still has the weapons or not. So that's security disarmament law. Then there's hybrid disarmament law, which has a mixed purpose. It's exemplified by what's called the Convention on Conventional Weapons, which has to be one of the best names for a convention, better known as the CCW. And it is a general treaty that has a lot of specific what they call protocols attached, which on different weapons, landmines, incendiary weapons, blinding lasers, etc. And this treaty has a combination of national security purpose and a humanitarian mission. Its preamble, for example, says that countries must refrain from the use of force against another country, and they shouldn't interfere with state sovereignty. At the same time, it recalls the principle of protecting civilians from the effects of war. So the hybrid treaties some are bans, some are regulation, but for the most part, they focus on the use of the weapon, not getting into production, stockpiling, etc.
And then there's the topic, the time we'll be focusing on today, which is humanitarian disarmament. And that was born in 1997 with the Mine Ban Treaty, which absolutely banned landmines. And the campaign to do so won the Nobel Peace Prize, as you may know. Humanitarian disarmament treaties have provisions to both prevent and to remediate civilian suffering. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. But it's important to note that their provisions can also benefit national security, so they're not exclusive, but their driving purpose is a humanitarian one, minimizing the civilian suffering of weapons. Today, as I mentioned, I'll focus on 2 case studies. First, the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions, which is the most recent humanitarian disarmament treaty, and also the most recent humanitarian disarmament campaign, which is a campaign to preemptively ban killer robots. So I want to start with cluster munitions. And the way I usually start this topic is with my famous so-called bomb show. So I have a little show and tell, and my caveat is always, if you're in a war zone and you see strange objects, do not pick them up unless you know what you're doing. But these are all safe, and they are some things I brought back from various research trips in war zones that I feel like illustrate better what I'm talking about. So a cluster munition is a large weapon. It can be a bomb dropped from the air or a rocket launched from the ground that contains dozens or hundreds of smaller weapons called submunitions. So this is a submunition. This is what they call BLU 97. Don't worry about the names. This is one I picked up in Afghanistan in 2002. So there are 202 of these in one cluster bomb. So that gives you a sense. They spread over the size of a football field. So it gives you a sense of the scale of the impact of these weapons. And I want to explain a little bit how they work, because I personally didn't understand them until I actually saw them in the field. I read about the descriptions, but it's too technical. So the way one of these works is you have what's called a spider, which sits on top here, and it fits in. The little silver pieces would be clicked in. When the bomb releases, the spider pops off. With that, there's a parachute pops up. So that's sitting above this, and that parachute serves 2 purposes. First, it stabilizes the submunition so that it hits perpendicular to the ground, or at least this is how it's supposed to work, because these things don't explode unless they hit perpendicular to the ground. The second thing is it arms the munition, which is this little plastic collar. And I just want to note, it's plastic, it's cheap, but this little piece is pulled up by the parachute, and this is what makes the weapon live. Once the weapon hits the ground or hits the target, if all goes well, it has this particular model has 3 effects. The first is it's anti-personnel. It kills or injures people. There's a steel core cylinder inside this, because obviously this has been smashed. Steel cylinder that's all scored. And this is a piece of it, and it breaks into very sharp fragments that spread a wide radius and can cause serious damage. And you're welcome to come up and look at these pieces after the talk is over. The second part is it has what's so-called shaped charge, which is a little copper piece that can melt. That when on impact, when it explodes, it melts into a copper slug that penetrates armor. So it penetrates tanks. So this little weapon can destroy a tank, can destroy humans. And the last piece that this has, which I don't have a piece of, thankfully, is an incendiary piece. So it starts fires as well. So this one weapon has 3 effects. The military likes it because of that triple effect. It also likes it because of what I call the area effect, the football field size. And that's beneficial for particularly for things like broad targets like airfields. You can destroy a runway. It's also beneficial for moving targets, because if you don't know exactly where a tank or an individual soldier is, if you just blanket the area, you're going to hit a target. The problem is that there are a couple problems, but one is these were designed mostly for Cold War era battles, where you have tank-on-tank battles or big infantry formations, not useful for urban warfare, which is what we're encountering mostly today. So there are 2 main humanitarian problems which we believe outweigh any military benefits. The first is because they spread over such a broad area, if they are used in urban areas or populated areas, even villages, they cause civilian casualties as well as military casualties because you have no control over them. And every war zone I've been to, every place I've investigated these, which includes Afghanistan, Iraq, Georgia, and Lebanon, these have been used in populated areas. So this is not the right place for them, but they are always used there. And so a lot of civilians have died as a result. The second problem is that many of them don't explode, so they lay around like landmines for months, years, and even decades after the conflict. There are still cluster munitions, submunitions left in Laos from the Vietnam War, which I'll talk about again in a minute. I want to show you a couple other models, but one, this is what's called a dual-purpose improved conventional munition, a DPICM. Again, don't worry about the name. The longer the better in military parlance. There are 644 of these in one rocket. It's a ground launch model. This particular one comes from Iraq, from a place called Hilla in south of Baghdad, and it has works similarly to the other one. It has, if you look on the inside, it's scored. So it's anti-personnel. It also has a shaped charge. I don't happen to have that piece. So it's anti-tank. It doesn't have the incendiary function. And instead of the big parachute, it has this little ribbon, which may be hard to see. But it's folded up, and when it's released, it becomes this little ribbon. So this particular model was used widely in Iraq, in particular, also used in Lebanon by Israel, used in Georgia by Russia, just to name a few examples. As I mentioned, there's 644 of these in one rocket. In Iraq, the U.S. usually launched volleys of 6 rockets, so that leads to over 3,800 submunitions spread over an area of about 1 kilometer. And the failure rate, according to the U.S. military, is about 16%. So whatever the math is, 4,000 of these during an attack, over as I say, often over a populated area, and then 16% of them don't explode, lingering long after the conflict. So, in my experience, the humanitarian effects have been devastating. A couple stories that struck my attention was one, a slum in Nahila, where this particular model that I showed you came from, was hit with these weapons and killed on impact, I don't remember exactly, but 30, 50, a few dozen, I think it was about 32 civilians, and injured hundreds more. That was just in the attack. Then, because they were so afraid of what they call duds, the ones that didn't explode, they couldn't even get ambulances in to take away the wounded. So that caused more effects, and then they continued to cause harm throughout the summer. This is launched in May 2003. When I was there, every house I visited had some sort of impact. Either they had been, someone had been injured or killed, or there were still live ones lying in their houses. A similar model, though not exactly the same model, also, as I said, kills long after the fact. So I was in Lebanon in 2006, and in October, a few months after the war between Hezbollah and Israel, and I was out doing research, and I encountered someone who said, "You must go to the village of Halta." So I went with my team to Halta, and we found out that 2 hours before, a young boy had been playing with his brother. His brother had been throwing pine cones at him from a tree. The boy picked something up to throw back at him. It turned out to be one of these. His friend said, no, drop it. So he went to reach to throw it away, and it exploded next to his head. So when I was there, they were cleaning up the remains, the blood, and it just really stuck with me about the harm that these weapons can cause 12-year-old boys, even months after a conflict. And those are just a few of the stories I've encountered. But I want to pause here and see if there are any questions about the technology or the harm these cause or how they work. Yeah, over there. I don't know where the mic's gone. You guys are good with the mic. I'm impressed.
We've had a lot of practice. Hi, thank you so much for being with us today. I guess I was just going to ask, you said that they were made first during the Cold War era, and who makes weapons like this, and I guess how do they get in the hands of who they end up in? That might be a really long question, but... Well,
the short answer, I don't have the exact can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's about 80 countries in the world have produced these weapons, around there. Maybe it's 75, I don't remember exactly. And a fair number more then get them through trade or exports or sales or whatever. They've even gone to what they call non-state armed groups like Hezbollah. Hezbollah launched some of them into Israel during the 2006 conflict. Nothing compared to what the 4 million Israel launched in Lebanon, but Hezbollah did have them, which shows the danger of the proliferation. Was there a second part of your question? Okay. Yeah, well, you've already spoken. Sorry, I'll give you over here, right behind you.
Behind me?
Right, you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Something that I've heard or read a little bit about is the advancement of these types of munitions and developing much more advanced technologies, such as, for example, heat-seeking cluster munitions,
right.
or cluster munitions that eventually, I guess, like, I'm not exactly sure what the terminology would be, but stop functioning after a designated amount of time. And so I'm curious what your opinion is on the difference between simply trying to ban them or trying to develop a more advanced, perhaps even more twisted version of warfare.
Right, right. No, that's a good question. For many years, the solution to cluster munitions that was touted was what's called the self-destruct mechanism, which I think is what you're talking about, which is that the ones that failed would self-destruct, would destroy themselves after a certain period of time, so they would not lay around like landmines for years. Well-intended, the problem is the technology is not proven to work. They were used, Brits used them for this one model for the first time in Basra in Iraq in 2003, a little bit. Israel used them much more widely in Lebanon. And they were supposed to have what's called a 1% dud rate. So 1% of them would not explode, would be left after an attack, which is pretty low, though arguably still not low enough, but pretty low. However, field research showed that when these were actually used in the field, not just tested under controlled circumstances, at least 10% of them didn't explode. So, and that was the best technology that had been developed. So we felt as campaigners that there's been no proof that what they call a technological fix would work, that it wasn't worth risking the time, therefore they should be banned. So I'll take one more next to you and then we'll move on.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, particularly after the lecture we just had. This may be a question that you're going to get into later on in your lecture, but how much of an element is there of the cat's already out of the bag type thinking, particularly when non-state actors who often aren't included in international treaties get their hands on these kinds of weapons?
So you mean the fact that they're out there, can the international law have an effect? Okay, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I think that first of all, in international law treaties, they bind the countries that have joined them. So that's one way you can have an effect that, obviously people can always violate the law, but if you've signed up to it, you're supposed to abide by it, and generally there's been very good compliance so far. There's also the issue of stigma. So for states that haven't signed on, there's a lot of pressure to abide by the law anyways once it becomes an emerging norm, which is the case in cluster munitions, particularly the case in landmines, which has been around longer. The mine ban treaty has been around longer. And for example, the U.S., which refuses to sign the mine ban treaty but still has landmines, has never used them since 1997, despite being in many conflicts. So that's an example of where stigma can have an effect. Of course, there are rogue states. Syria, Libya were the two most recent uses of cluster munitions, although very small use. But they've attracted widespread condemnation, and Syria is using everything. So you want to control them as well, but I think that the effects are, there are definitely advantages to international law, even if it's not perfect. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on and show you a short video that was made for what's the first meeting of states parties to the Convention on Cluster Munitions. That's a long way of saying the first time the treaty requires states to meet every year to discuss the convention. This was the first time they met. It was in Laos. It was significant for Laos because that is a country that suffered more from contamination than any other country. It's during the Vietnam War. The U.S. dropped 270 million submunitions of those little ones on Laos that left 80 million duds, millions of which are still there. They've caused more than 7,500 civilian casualties, and they're still going on. When I was there for this meeting, And there were a couple of children killed just during that week. So I'll let you hit play and I'll tell you when to stop. It's just a few minutes of this. I show that video for twofold. One is to show you help you visualize what happens when these weapons are dropped, and so you can see the power of them. And I want you to envision on top of that all the pieces I showed you that are apt to fail. The parachute sometimes pops off. The thing doesn't arm because it's a little plastic piece. It lands horizontal to the ground so it doesn't explode, and then it lies around. It also often catches in trees. Those little ribbons I showed you hang around in olive trees. Kids think the ribbons are handles, so they swing I talked to one father whose child was swinging one of these the second time I showed you around on her finger. Fortunately, he got to her in time. So imagine the terror of it being dropped combined with those potential for failure. I also show you that film on a more upbeat note, because the film ends with the scenes from the signing ceremony in Oslo when the treaty that absolutely banned these weapons was signed, which was, I was there, it was certainly probably the highlight of my professional career. And so I want to turn now to talking about more upbeat things about how this treaty tackled this problem. So it's a humanitarian, so I mentioned it's a humanitarian disarmament treaty, so its humanitarian purpose is laid out very clearly from the beginning. The first paragraph of its preamble, the part at the beginning of a treaty, expresses concern about civilians bearing the brunt of armed conflict. And the second lays out its purpose. Quote, states parties are determined to put an end for all time to the suffering and casualties caused by cluster munitions at the time of their use, when they fail to function, or when they are abandoned. So that sets the scene for this treaty. And then it has three types of provisions that are characteristic of a humanitarian disarmament treaty. First, absolute preventive obligations. You read a little bit about this in the article. They are a complete ban on the not only use, but also the production, transfer, and stockpiling of these weapons, as well as assistance in assisting other countries in doing these activities. There's also stockpile destruction required within 8 years, and this is designed to prevent future harm to civilians. Then there's remedial measures that are very civilian-centered, and these don't appear in things like the Chemical Weapons Convention or the Biological Weapons Convention, which are designed to minimize suffering after the effect. There's clearance of the ones that are left behind was required within 10 years. In the meantime, countries must educate the public about the dangers of the weapons. And there must be victim assistance, which is the most groundbreaking provision of the treaty, because it requires states that have been affected by cluster munitions to provide physical and psychological and socioeconomic assistance for victims of cluster munition attacks. And the victims can be individuals, families, or communities, which are some of the issues we talked about when we talked about the harm that weapons cause. The third pillar of this is cooperative approaches to implementation. It's based on an assumption that there's goodwill among countries, which isn't necessarily what you saw in your quiz in the first half of the class or the day. But there is cooperation, and part of that is that an affected state, a state where the cluster munitions have been dropped, can receive assistance from other states. Those other countries are required actually to provide assistance to help them clear the cluster munitions, to help them provide victim assistance. And there's also a compliance, what they call cooperative compliance, which means that states are encouraged to work things out between themselves instead of having rigid verification like the convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, where you can have on-spot investigations or more rigorous or more rigid measures. So this is more of a cooperative approach, and has been, although it seems a little wimpy, it has been proved effective in the mine ban treaty context. There has been not sure there's been any use, very limited use by any countries that have joined the convention, and that any compliance questions have been worked out in a cooperative way. The Convention on Cluster Munitions is also important because it exemplifies the process used to adopt humanitarian disarmament treaties. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And this was a process, as Meg mentioned at the beginning, that I was very involved in. The move to ban cluster munitions started in a hybrid disarmament forum, going back to the CCW, the Convention on Conventional Weapons. But countries got fed up, this went on for years, but they got fed up with the stalemate in the UN and the slowness to act. And they were also outraged in 2006 by Israel's use of 4 million submunitions in Lebanon. 90% of those were used in the last 3 days after there was promise of a ceasefire. So this outraged the international community, and countries moved outside of the UN to an independent process called the Oslo process because it was initiated by Norway. And you saw, hence the signing ceremony was in Norway that you saw a minute ago. The Oslo process was modeled on the Ottawa process, which produced the Mine Ban Treaty, and is characterized by its participants, its forum, and its ground rules. So first look at the participants. There was a core group of like-minded countries that directed the process, led by Norway, but also included Austria, Ireland, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, and the Holy See. So these are sort of mid-level, mid to small-level powers, not the US, Russia, not the big major military powers, but it showed the impact these countries can have. And they got support from a diverse group of other countries around the world, from developed countries and developing countries. 3/4 of the affected countries participated in the process, and half of the stockpilers plus 2/3 of the users and producers participate. So there was a wide range of participants. There were also international organizations, some of the institutions you talked about this morning, like the UN, various agencies in the UN, also the International Committee on the Red Cross. I don't know if you've studied that this month, but that's another important institution in the law of war. And civil society, non-governmental organizations were led by the Cluster Munition Coalition, which was the driving force behind the process. It was included 350 NGOs from 100 countries, and hundreds of CMC members attended these negotiating sessions, and they participated in a variety of ways. They sat at the negotiating table where they had almost the same power as state diplomats in terms of discussing proposals. They produced research and advocacy materials providing background information that countries did not have. They often came to us for information. They, of course, did lobbying in the back room, and then they did more grassroots activities like protests or petition drives. You saw a couple images in there. And then finally, survivors played a key role. They really humanized the story and lobbied for various provisions. One of the testimonies that stuck out for me was of a 16-year-old named Suraj who came from Afghanistan. And he was 16 when I first heard his story, and he came to one of these conferences in Vienna. And 4 years earlier, so when he was 12 years old, he had stepped on a submunition of the type, the first type I showed you, the yellow one. And he had stepped on a submunition, and he was so badly injured, the doctor told his father not to try to save him. Fortunately, his father overruled the doctor. He did lose both his legs, but he survived and has become a major advocate in the international campaign against these weapons. So this inclusive approach ensured that a range of perspectives were represented, and it also gave extra support and weight to the final product. Other elements of the process that are important is it was in an independent forum outside of the UN. Conferences were held in all the core group, most of the core group's capitals, which made my mother very happy because I wasn't in war zones anymore. I was traveling to first world capitals. And it allowed for new rules. So instead of the UN slow process, there was a timeline. They set a deadline for, started in 2008, they set a deadline for, started in 2007, they set a deadline for 2008. It was completed in 15 months, which is really rapid for international law. The core group that I mentioned earlier retained control of the text, so they took feedback and then they would produce new drafts instead of the more complicated process, which I won't get into, but where it's much more chaotic and every version's out there and then they debate them and they get nowhere. But this was sort of, it was like having a leader that could sort of move the process along. And also, most importantly, no consensus was required. Consensus sounds like a good thing, but is actually very problematic in international law. It basically means that not that there's unanimity, but that no country objects to a decision, say a treaty in this case. But the problem is it also allows one country to block a whole process. So in the CCW, if one country showed any inclination of voting against a cluster munition convention, it would go nowhere. In the Oslo process, that you could always go to a vote, and if someone objected or if they lost the vote, they could leave the process, but they couldn't block the product, the final product. In fact, there was no vote, and all the countries that participated in the process agreed to join the treaty. But that threat there made a big difference. So as the film said at the end, the work is just beginning. The goal, we need to persuade more states to join the treaty, and we need to push for countries to adopt strong implementation laws at the national level. Whenever you have an international treaty, generally you have to adopt domestic laws to implement it at the national level. We have had good progress so far. So far, more than half the world has joined the treaty. There are 113 states that have joined, by which I mean signed or ratified. Signing means you're bound by the object and purpose, so you can no longer use cluster munitions. Ratification means you're bound by all provisions, which means even the more detailed provisions, such as details of clearance and stuff, you're also bound by. So 113 have joined, 84 are fully bound by all the provisions. There's been a significant reduction in stockpiles. In the UK, recently destroyed its last submunitions, and it was one of the biggest users of cluster munitions in the past, so that's a major step forward. As I mentioned earlier in the question session, there have been use has been primarily limited to rogue countries, Gaddafi's Libya and Assad's Syria. But more than 110 states, the last time I counted, had stepped up and condemned Syria's use. So there's definitely a strong international objection to this. So I think I have time for a few questions, if there are any, on the cluster mission. Then we'll move on to fully autonomous weapons, and there are many. Claire. Oh, good. I just happened to pick where the mic was.
So building off of Becca's question earlier, how easy or difficult is it for rogue actors or actors of concern to create cluster munitions outside of the formal processes? Or is it pretty easy to monitor the production of these weapons?
I think I don't have the numbers at my fingertips of how many producers have joined or not joined. I think that, again, it goes to stigma for the non-parties, Like the U.S., for example, is a major producer, or has been a major producer of cluster munitions. However, because of the pressure of this campaign, they have they issued a policy a few years ago that they wouldn't produce any more cluster munitions that had less than a 1% failure rate. So they imposed a national measure on themselves. Surprisingly, they haven't been able to produce a cluster munition that meets those specifications, so they are no longer producing, even though they're one of the major producers. We don't know what's going on in Russia and China, for example. I don't know if Syria is a producer. I think it may have just inherited them from the Soviet Union. So the stigma, again, plays a role in production, but there's limits to how much monitoring.
In terms of non-state actors, do they have the capabilities to produce them, or do you need to be a sort of formal producer to do so?
Well, I suppose theoretically they could, but to my knowledge, no non-state actors have that facility because it would require a certain amount of technology. So yeah, right there.
Thank you for being here. I guess my question is more technical. Now that these sub-munitions are out there and they seem to be very volatile or easy to set off, how would states or organizations even start to disarm them? Or
right.
How could you even stop
them? There's a whole field of demining, they call it, explosive ordnance disposal. And even though it's demining, it's much more than mines. And it's a very complicated and slow process, an expensive process, but it's effective. I mean, they do great work, and the deminers I really admire because I'm looking at them, but they're actually out handling these things. Some cluster munitions are sensitive enough that most of them need to be destroyed in place. So first you have to find them. They have these large metal detectors. They square off the territory and go through the metal, the territory of the metal detector. Once they find them, they have to set in different ways to explode them. You can either sort of plant an explosive on it. The one that the yellow ones I showed you, they put a little tripod over it with a smaller explosive that would knock it out but not set off the big explosion. Sometimes they'll have a timed explosive. Sometimes they'll sort of put a fuse that, roll out a fuse and then run the other direction and push the button, sort of like you see in the cartoons. There's a range of things, but it's very dangerous. And I don't know if this ever happened, but one of the deminers in Afghanistan told me that the yellow ones were so sensitive that even this change in heat, change in temperature could set them off. So for example, he worried that I don't know that this happened, but he worried that a deminer standing over in the hot Afghanistan sun, standing over it, setting up things would lower the temperature with the shadow, and that could cause an accident. Again, I don't know if it ever happened, but deminers do unfortunately get killed or injured in these processes. So it's a slow process, but there is the technology to do it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This talk's been really, really interesting and different from what we're used to. So.
Don't usually get bombs?
No, it's new. I was wondering about, we've all heard the phrase, like, all is fair in love and war.
Right.
And so I'm wondering how much, if a country were to be attacked or some new conflict arise, how much they would adhere to, say, banning this sort of use.
Right.
If they were really afraid and maybe turn to use this, is it by sanctions, or how do you prevent something like that from happening?
Okay, great. That's a great question. Couple answers to that. So first of all, if you're if you've already joined the treaty, you're legally not allowed to use them. Now, law and politics are two different things, but legally you would not be allowed to use them. International law, as you probably have encountered, there's limited enforcement mechanism in terms of courts. I mean, there are some international criminal law courts, but there's limited enforcement. So it would be things like sanctions, condemnation, diplomatic measures that could be used to enforce the treaty. There's nothing in the treaty itself. It does say it can go, if there's a compliance problem, you can take it to the International Court of Justice. So that would be one mechanism. If a country that was a party to has used them, that hasn't happened yet, but it could theoretically happen. Another thing is that it also highlights why it's so important not just to ban the use, which some treaties do, but to ban the production, stockpile, and transfer. Because if you get, like the UK, major user, if you get them to destroy all their stockpiles, when a war comes, they're not tempted to use them. And that can happen, even if a thing is banned. If you have it in your stockpile and the right circumstance comes up, you're tempted to use them. So those proliferation measures are crucial for achieving the goal, and that's why there's strict deadlines on them. So does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you.
Over there, behind you.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I wanted to ask you about the Oslo process. So you were talking about how wonderfully fast this happened, and a lot of the benefits of moving outside of the formal institutions like the UN. Could you talk a little bit more about whether you think that using this process for something like cluster munitions was a unique circumstance, or whether using or moving outside the processes of the UN, if you think that that would be productive in other circumstances? And I'm asking in the context of we are all working on projects to propose global improvements to infrastructure. You don't have to talk about that if you want, but I wanted to hear more about that process.
Well, I mean, having participated in the Oslo process and seen the effectiveness of it, I'm definitely a believer in that approach to international law. It doesn't mean it's always the right answer, and I would totally concede that. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution. I do think when it was done, very similar, although not quite the same, but pretty much the same process occurred in the 96, 97 to produce the Mine Ban Treaty. And I think everyone thought, you know, one-time thing, aberration, NGOs did a lot of work, and, you know, we banned landmines. Great. But the fact that the Cluster Convention came along with the same process shows to me that this is here to stay. This is an more increasingly accepted form of international law and international law creation. And I think it can definitely be used for other weapons, and there have been people already talking about where it could be used. I'll talk about the killer robots in a minute. Nuclear weapons are even occurring, and there's some challenges with nuclear weapons. They're sort of their own beast because they're a very national security issue, but there has been an increasing movement to deal with the humanitarian effects and try to adopt sort of something on the Oslo process. Probably wouldn't be exactly the same, but there has been talk about adapting it to other weapons. Also incendiary weapons is another example. I'm very interested, and I haven't done research on it, but I personally am interested in how could this process be used for non-weapons treaties. And I think it has a lot of potential. It hasn't been, to my understanding, a little bit, I think, with the Rome International Criminal Court. They had a somewhat similar role of NGOs, but not quite the same. So that's something in my free time I'd like to do more research into. The one thing I can mention is that a colleague of mine and I wrote an article on climate change refugees, totally different subject. And again, this is just an article just proposing an idea, but we worked through how an Oslo process could work in that sphere. So not saying it will happen, but it's interesting to think about creatively about how it could be adapted and what you would need to adapt it beyond disarmament. But in principle, it's nothing that should be limited to disarmament. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if there have been any attempts to negotiate with groups like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, which, correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not 100% sure, but seem to tend to rely on these types of explosives that cause a lot of civilian casualties. Do you think that those types of talks are feasible, or have there been any attempts?
Well, there's two different levels here. One in the terms of cluster munitions. I believe Hezbollah is the only non-state armed group, or at least that's confirmed to have used them. And that's partly because, you know, where it's proliferated to, and partly because of the technology. Like these things are very cheap and simple to make, but you have to have the launching mechanism. You have to have the bomb or the rocket that launches them. So there hasn't been widespread use. More so with landmines, which are much more common among non-state actors. I haven't been involved with it, but there has been movement to talk to non-state armed groups, rebel groups, guerrilla groups, whatever you want to call them. There's an organization in Geneva called Geneva Call that works specifically on that issue. And for example, they've had encouraged armed groups or non-state actors to sign on to the Mine Ban Treaty, even though they can't legally be parties, but to sort of issue a pledge that they will not use the landmines. I think the Palestinian Authority is one of them, but don't quote me on that. But they're, as far as I know, one of the leaders in that, and they do a lot of engagement with non-state actors. Leads to endless controversy at CCW because the Turks in particular don't like the fact they've talked to the Turkish opposition, and therefore the Turks want to kick them out of the CCW meetings, and then to do that they have to kick all the NGOs out, and they want to kick out Human Rights Watch, etc., and so we have to push back, and it creates a lot of drama. But I think it's an important thing to be doing because they are, particularly landmines, one of the biggest users, and there's other weapons as well. So I'll take one more question. How about in the back row there, and then I'll move on to robots, and I'll give you some more time for questions, hopefully, at the end.
Thank you so much for talking to us. My question is about how these treaties address the larger system. It seems to me that warfare is to create as much devastation and damage as possible so that the country's costs outweigh the benefits of continuing warfare. And it seems to me like we're on a treadmill almost. Like as we move forward in banning these weapons, new technologies are developed that are just as deadlier or just as deadly or deadlier. And if anything, it seems like these treaties advantage developed countries that have developed these weapons and have used them, and as less powerful countries develop these similar technologies, these treaties ban those weapons, and developed countries continue to come up with new technologies for warfare. So can you talk about how these treaties fit into the bigger picture?
Right, and that's actually going to be a very nice transition to my next topic of fully autonomous weapons. But yeah, I mean, it is, international law is often going after the last war. You know, how do you correct, like, you know, the gas protocol I mentioned. There's gas was used in World War I, then you have a protocol that bans it. That's great, and it kept it from being, for the most part, used again. There are exceptions. But how do you take advantage, how do you be preemptive? In terms of, and that's what I'm going to talk about with the fully autonomous weapons. In terms of advantaging rich countries, that can be seen either way. I think to a certain extent you're right, because they have the ability to come up with new technology. On the other hand, they're often the most vocal opponents to these treaties, particularly with cluster munitions. Landmines were more universally possessed. Cluster munitions are a slightly higher tech weapon, so it's more the major military powers that are the users and producers. And therefore, like the US has not joined onto this treaty, Russia and China and Israel have not. We believe it still has an effect because, as I talked about stigma earlier, but they both don't want to join on because they don't want their arsenals restricted, but they also don't want the obligation of having to pay to destroy their weapons, for example. We argue that it can be done, it's not as expensive as you think, and there's also this international cooperation that's required. So you can get help from other states, whether it's financial help or technological help. And a state like the UK, which had a relatively large stockpile, has successfully destroyed well before its deadline. So the poor, rich country cuts both ways. So I think I'll use that to transition into the next major humanitarian disarmament campaign, which is about fully autonomous weapons, also known as killer robots. These weapons, which don't exist yet but are in the works, would identify a target and fire on a target without any meaningful human intervention. So they're the step beyond drones. Drones are remote control. There's someone in the United States, for example, using a joystick, guiding a drone around Pakistan, choosing what to fire, and then pushing the button. These weapons would be deployed and would have their own, they make the life and death decisions on the battlefield without that remote control factor. So they don't exist yet, but it is becoming a pressing issue because there are precursors that are showing that autonomy is becoming increasingly important to military development, and there's also military planning documents that reflect that as well. So many people, when I explain what a fully autonomous weapon is, have sort of strong initial gut reactions. So I want to ask for some of you guys to say, what do you think of this idea? You think good idea, bad idea? There's a lot of different, legal, ethical, moral reasons for that. Yeah, right here.
It just seems really dangerous and foolish that, I don't personally support drones either, but at least there's someone controlling it, so there's some human control there. And the fact that you would create a weapon or a robot that can do whatever it wants just seems, I don't know why anyone would want to do that.
Because sort of the lack of control issue. Yeah, and that's definitely an important one. And I should mention that with drones, it's a good point, one way we distinguish these campaigns, and you can be against both or against one or the other, is with drones, in general, the concern, at least I have and Human Rights Watch has, is how they're being used. So this choice of what they call targeted killing, assassinations. Whereas with robots, the concern is more with the weapon itself, that it would always be problematic. So next to you.
I could see from a strategic standpoint why it would make sense in terms of reducing on the ground casualties for an army. But I agree with Sarah in that then it brings up a whole other issue of having these weapons and who controls them and who makes that decision on the battlefield.
So sort of two issues of control I think you're driving at. One is a technological issue, like can you technologically control them, and one is more sort of the mental, should humans be controlling the life and death decision? There's slightly different things. In the front row there.
I also think of the issue of accountability and who's held responsible, particularly if, considering the risk of malfunction with the new technology.
Right, yeah, accountability is a really huge issue. There's different levels of accountability you can have. Traditionally in international law, you can hold the commander responsible, and there's limited circumstances in which you can do that, but should they be held responsible for an autonomous thing? Do you hold the programmer or manufacturer responsible, but there's legal problems with that, so it's a good point. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I also wonder how would these robots distinguish between actual enemies and people who are just at the wrong spot at the wrong time?
Exactly, yeah. So, and that's both a practical issue and a legal issue. I don't know if you've studied the laws of war at all, but distinguishing between soldier and civilian is one of the basic rules of the laws of war. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Front row here.
So building somewhat off of that, I can definitely see how people would be... It's hard enough to distinguish between civilian and soldier, especially under the conditions of unconventional warfare. But I can see a pushback against completely banning the technology because there are also... that same type of technology could be used for beneficial purposes, and I feel like that's something that people would argue a lot. We could use this same type of technology of fully autonomous robots, not necessarily as specifically weapons, but for gathering intelligence or supplies and supply trains. So I could see there being a pushback against banning the technology.
Yeah, and that's
complicates
important.
Things.
Yeah, good thing to observe. How about back there?
Thank you. On exactly that note, I thought I heard about some technologies where you'll have a fully autonomous robot with the sole purpose of, for example, moving wounded soldiers. And so how do you draw those distinctions? And now what if you want to defend that robot? What's the difference between defending its own technology and simply using it as an aggressive tool?
Yeah. And I want to talk more about that issue of development in a minute, because I think that's a really crucial one and one we get a lot of pushback on. Any other reactions that people wanted to raise? Yeah, right back there.
I just find the whole idea of using robots to be really scary because it takes kind of the idea of like heartless killing to a whole new level where you have something that's just going in to program to kill other people, do whatever it takes. And I feel like that's just something that hasn't crossed my mind until now, but kind of shocks me.
Yeah, so that's sort of a moral issue and sort of the shock, the gut conscience, problem. Yeah, one more right in front of you.
It also, I'm one who likes to look for the reason why you would want to develop these.
Right, that's good.
To understand it. But it also just kind of seems like a bad idea because we talked about the difference between the difficulty in distinguishing between a civilian and a combatant. And how do you distinguish between their combatants and your combatants? Especially since artificial intelligence often makes generalizations and therefore has blind spots.
Right.
And I feel like once you picked up on what those blind spots are, it would be really easy to exploit those either to protect your own soldiers or to get the robots to target their handlers.
Yeah, that's a good point because it goes to a couple issues. One is the lack of control. There's a lot of chances to confuse the robots or even to hack them. There's concerns about that. And also the protection of soldiers is not just a civilian issue. One thing we concern, in addition to distinguishing soldiers and civilians, what about distinguishing between a wounded soldier and a soldier that's fighting or a soldier that's surrendering? How can you guarantee that they're surrendering? There are stories of, you may have heard of in Iraq, of Iraqi soldiers just surrendering to drones, which obviously didn't know what to do with them. But this would be even more tricky because they're not remote controlled. So a couple other issues that I wanted to raise in terms of the benefits. I think someone mentioned, it saves soldiers' lives, which is a good thing. Certainly something I think is important. Some people argue that they don't have emotions, so therefore they're less apt to act in anger or fear, and anger and fear are sometimes the things that can cause civilian casualties, and that they wouldn't be afraid of. They wouldn't have to protect themselves, so therefore they could be more conservative about when they chose to fire. On the other hand, I think those can be countered for many of the reasons you mentioned, the failure to distinguish between soldiers and civilians or different types of soldiers. And in terms of the emotion, in addition to lacking fear and anger, they also lack compassion, which is one of the major safeguards against killing in war. And then also the accountability cap, the moral question. And some people are concerned that it could even make war more likely. This could be said of drones as well, but by protecting soldiers, which you want to do, it lowers the threshold for going to war. So that raises questions as well. There have been a lot of, and I think one thing that strikes me about this issue, having worked on other disarmament issues as well, is how wide a spread of types of arguments there are. Some people initially go to the legal arguments. Some people initially go to the moral arguments. Some people initially go instinctively go to the accountability arguments. That's one reason I like to do this poll, is because you guys had very diverse reactions. But even my law students sometimes like, oh, forget the law. What about the morality of life and death decision making by machines? So I think to me that's also a strong reason for banning them, is because of this variety of problems. I just want to outline a few of the developments so far. The first, the advocacy campaign against them started pretty much in November 2012, with a report issued by Human Rights Watch and my clinic at Harvard called Losing Humanity. And it called for an absolute ban on the development, production, and use of these weapons. And then in April, the NGO campaign, the official launch of the so-called Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which is the NGO campaign, the equivalent of the Cluster Munition Coalition, launched in London in April. It currently consists of 48 NGOs spread across 23 countries and is definitely growing quickly. Every week I get another email from my listserv from a couple other organizations that want to join. And just to clarify their call, as I said, they wanted a ban on absolute ban on development, production, and use. Use is pretty straightforward. The reason I wanted to highlight the development, because a couple of people raised that issue earlier, is we're not calling for a ban on development of all fully autonomous technology. And I think that's very important to distinguish, because a lot of people have that reaction of, well, wait, there are so many good things that robots can do. We're not trying to stop those. It means that the ban on development may be a very narrow one, because the technology is multi-purpose. So you can, fully autonomous technology may come very close to being a weapon, and it's just the last step that you don't want them to make in terms of development and production. But we feel like even if that's a narrow prohibition, it's a good, important one. It's a symbolic one. Countries should not be actively soliciting that kind of technology, weaponized technology, even if they want to use fully autonomous technology for good purposes. A couple other developments: the U.S. Department of Defense became the first to issue a national policy. Actually, it was 3 days after. I think it was coincidence, but 3 days after the Human Rights Watch Harvard report came out. They recognized their problems with these weapons, and they said that autonomous systems cannot be used to deliver force for 5 to 10 years. So in essence, it's a temporary moratorium on the issue. Which is a great step forward, and it shows that even the leader in autonomous technology is recognizing these concerns. There are some loopholes. There are various complicated waivers that you can get if there's extreme urgent military necessity, or certain high-level approval that you can use these weapons in a lethal way. But at least it's a step forward. Special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, I don't know if you've talked about these positions, but they're sort of independent experts at the UN, issued a report to the Human Rights Council in May, echoing the concern of the NGO campaign, calling for national moratoria, temporary holds on these weapons until an international solution is worked out. And then most recently, and perhaps most importantly, the good old CCW, Convention on Conventional Weapons, states agreed in November, it's 115 countries, agreed to initiate discussions on the fully autonomous weapons next year, or now this year, I guess. And it seems like a small step because they're not actually negotiating a treaty, but it's crucial because, first of all, it shows that even major military powers, US, Russia, China, Israel, UK, et cetera, that are developing these weapons, agreed to hold discussions. So they're taking a step forward. And it also, CCW, even though it hasn't produced that much over the past 10, 20 years, a little bit, but it's often an incubator for disarmament issues, as it was with the Mine Ban Treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions. So while progress is being made, it's important to remember that time is of the essence, even though these things don't exist yet. Some would argue, and I think this came out a little in our discussion, that we should wait and see. You can't tell if they're going to be a problem until they're fully developed. Why don't we wait and see if they, because proponents of the fully autonomous weapons say you can have all sorts of safeguards and artificial intelligence that will ensure that they protect civilians or, wounded soldiers and the like. And that's a fair argument, but we believe a preemptive ban is important. First of all, because the more countries invest in technology, the less likely they are to want to give it up. So if you get down that road, it can be too late to change course. It also could will help prevent an arms race. If one country starts developing technology, another country will, and then it just spirals out of control. Prevents proliferation, even if good states, states that normally abide by the laws of war or care about civilians, could use these things in a proper humanitarian way. They're going to get in the hands of countries like Syria and Libya and whatever, somewhere down the road. There's also precedent for preemptively banning weapons. The CCW's protocol on blinding lasers, lasers that permanently blind individuals, were banned before they were fielded. And for many of the same reasons, which is people's just gut reaction that it is unnecessary and just wrong to blind soldiers or civilians permanently. It's not necessary for the conduct to achieve military advantage. And finally, there's the precautionary principle, which is a principle actually you draw from primarily environmental law, but it appears in other international law as well, which states that if there's scientific uncertainty, which there certainly is in this case about how they would be developed, there's scientific uncertainty, there's no reason not to take steps. In some ways you actually should take steps to prevent a potential threat. So in conclusion, before I open the floor up again, I just want to say I hope that it's given you a good sense of the current trend in disarmament law, this humanitarian trend, and provided a counterpoint to some of the probably national security discussions you've been having. And as I mentioned earlier, people thought this was an aberration in the 90s, but I think that it's a phenomenon that's here to stay. And the Killer Robots campaign demonstrates its possibilities for future weapons as well as past weapons. You guys raised that issue, and that's a very good one to think about. And there's several other weapons that are, as I mentioned, nukes. Incendiary weapons is another one, and also this issue of what they call explosive weapons being used in populated areas, urban conflict. Not trying to ban urban conflict, but it causes severe humanitarian concerns. This increasingly emphasis on humanitarian issues in disarmament law and law of war in general is really important. So I hope you'll keep that humanitarian side as part of your consideration of some of the global issues you deal with this month. So I think I have 7 minutes for questions, so yeah. Down to the end of the aisle there.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. You discussed the promotion of a more narrow prohibition of these killer robots. I have a question more about the commercialized use of drones. So a few months ago, Jeff Bezos had debuted the idea of using drones for the future of delivery of packages.
Right.
With your expertise, do you think this is a feasible future for the use of drones? And if so, what do you think that impact will have on the military use of drones?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'm not a roboticist, so I can't confirm that that's the technology of whether that's likely or not. I do know that I saw another story, I think it was in Philadelphia, of drones already being used to deliver dry cleaning. I don't know if you saw this. It was pretty funny. This little airplane flying in the sky with people's pressed shirts hanging down. And so technologically, I think it might be possible. I'm not sure it's actually very efficient to have a lot of people remote controlling drones when they could just use UPS. But and also, I mean, personally, I don't know, setting aside the military side, I don't want my airspace cluttered with 1 million drones delivering Amazon packages, let alone dry cleaning or whatever else. So I don't think that's a great idea, not because of military reasons, but just, I think, you know, you have to think about accuracy and pollution in a way of these kind of things. That said, technologically, it does seem like it might be feasible, and it's sort of an indication of how much this autonomy, interest in autonomy and technological development show that killer robots are a real possibility down the road. Scientists seem to disagree about whether it could be a couple of years for the most primitive, fully autonomous weapons to 20, 30 years for more sophisticated ones. So some of it's how they define them, about when the timeline, but it could very well be possible. In terms of the military impact, there's certainly, anytime you develop technology, it is likely to have military impacts, and sometimes military technology actually goes the other way too. Military develops technology then used for commercial purposes. But I think it doesn't seem right to stop the commercial development. I think it's more important to, because it can have good purposes, but it's more important to make sure it's regulated at the military level. So yeah, go in the way back row there.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciated the show and tell component of your presentation. I don't know where else I could get the opportunity to see the weapons up close like that. So my question was related to we talked about killer robots, and I was wondering if there are plans, or whether we're in the process of developing robots that can demine, so deactivate.
I think there are, actually, yeah. I mean, I know there have been, my understanding, and I don't know the details, is there have been remote-controlled ones. I don't know if they're fully autonomous ones. If anyone else knows differently, chime in. But that's definitely an area that has been investigated, and would be, that'd be a very positive development if you could get robots to defuse mines or cluster munitions. Yeah, that's a good idea. Over here.
Hi, I'm Fiona. Thank you so much for being here. The video that you showed was very impactful, and my question is slightly different. It's about the survivors.
Mm-hmm.
And as a researcher and someone who has been on site, I was wondering if you talked about there being initiatives on education for people in impacted areas to educate them. I'm wondering how do you approach this, and how do you actually educate them, because they're already recovering from one effect, and then you go in and try to educate them on what has just happened and the possibility of weapons still being in an area for the long term.
Right.
So what type of initiatives what initiatives are put in place to actually educate, especially young individuals?
Right. Yeah, there's a whole field of what they call risk education, to warn people that, particularly children actually, because they're, at least with cluster munitions, among the most vulnerable, to warn people about the risks of these things lying around. There's a whole range of things that are done. There are posters. I've been in, as I say, many of these war zones, and you see posters everywhere, billboards, there's radio advertisements, there's TV advertisements in places that have TVs, but you have to remember a lot of these places don't have TVs. Some people can't even read, so they often have illustrations. You know, I've got a poster of Afghanistan of this guy walking along, and he looks at a yellow thing, you know, one of those yellow submunitions on the ground, and he goes like this, and then he sets he's told, you know, the next image says, put a stone there, and then go get official help, and then come back and someone will take care of it, so mark it, but get out of there. So those are some things. There's a lot of, at the schools, they're very active in risk education. Sometimes they have puppet shows. I don't think of some of the others. So it's very, very creative thinking. There's a whole realm of experts that know more about than I do, but those are some of the ones I've encountered. And there's a couple, and they've been effective, because I mentioned, not always, but sometimes they've been effective, because I mentioned the girl spinning the submunition on her finger. Thankfully, it didn't go off, but the only reason her father knew not to stop her was because he heard it on the radio that these things were dangerous. So that was a case of a happy ending. And the one other thing I want to mention to wrap up is that you have to teach people not only to not to pick them up, play with them, not to be wary of them in your fields, because people often hit them with their plows. But you also have to make sure people don't clear them themselves, because there's a major movement. Understandably, people have them in their fields. They want to protect, they want to get back to farming, so they pick them up and carry them places. They try to burn them, but unfortunately is not effective, so it just makes them, as you can't see them because they're charred and more dangerous, and then they still blow up. There was a story in Lebanon of people, this guy put dozens of them in a box and went to take them to the UN, and the bottom broke out. So these are things, understandable instinct to try to clear your land, to take those risks to protect your children, but it's very important as that part of the education to prevent people from doing that, to instead report clusters or mines they find and get the proper authorities to come in, because it can make the situation worse. So is that pulling the plug? With that said, yeah. Join me in thank you. Thanks a lot.